We at Foundation are incredibly blessed to have several former pastors or current retired, or not current retired, but former pastors and missionaries in our family here at Foundation. And today you get to hear from one of them, and I'm super excited that you get to do this. This guy is one of the best communicators of the gospel that I have personally ever heard. Michael and his wife Molly, Michael and Molly Gunnan, have been a part of Foundation, I think, since the very beginning, Molly, close to the beginning, something like that. And their entire family is a part of it, extended family, everything. They have 3 boys that are awesome, Bradley, Grayson, and Dylan. And Michael has been in ministry for 20 plus years, ranging from being a lead pastor to college professor, now to his role at an organization called Walk Through the Bible. And this is a really cool title. I have never had like a super cool title like this, but I really like saying it. So he's the Chief Growth Officer for Walk Through the Bible. And that probably means a whole lot of things that I don't know what it means. But he's incredible. He's very gifted and passionate speaker and shares the gospel all over the place. The heart of Walk Through the Bible, that they want everybody, everywhere, to be able to live out the Bible. So they take the Bible into all portions of the world to share the gospel and the good news about Jesus. And we're talking about art and science camp this week. You saw some of the stuff that's hanging up and the stuff here. And Michael's youngest son, Dylan, was a part of that this week. And those of you that know Dylan know that he's a blessing. And so he was a part of that. And Michael's going to talk a little bit more about that at the beginning. But man, we're excited, Michael, to have you here. Molly, Michael, family, thank you for what you do for Foundation.
Thanks, Jason, for those 2 kind of words. Dylan was at Art and Science Camp. It was funny, Friday night we came to the Art and Science show, and I was joking with someone. It'd be really interesting to have a child psychologist to come and look at all of the kids' self-portraits. I just thought that would be fascinating, and I had not seen my own kid's self-portrait at that point. And so then Dylan decided to show me his picture, and I looked at it, and it was odd. And there was red all over his face, to which he said, "That's blood." And I thought, we need the child psychologist. I said, maybe we could just call that ketchup from Chick-fil-A or something. I don't know. So I should probably warn you. First service, I did okay. About 3 weeks ago, I got COVID. It's the first time I've had COVID. You guys on the front are safe. I think I'm not contagious anymore. But I've had a nagging cough that you get with COVID. So I've got a pocket full of cough drops and a bottle of water. So we're going to see what happens. But I did tell the guys in the back to keep their finger on the mute button just in case I get to hacking a little bit. Any dog people? Yeah, some dog folks. You ask if there's any cat people, that's a very polarizing question. Any dog people seems safe. We've got a dog. His name's Nick. He's a black lab. We call him Nick because we named him after St. Nicholas, because we got him on Christmas Day. That was sweet. I wanted to name him Joe or Joseph after Joseph from the Christmas story. And then his full name was going to be Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, because I thought it'd be really funny if he was like running down the street, "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, get back here." We went to pick him up, and he didn't look like a Joe. And so we named him Nick. Nick's a good dog. He's a fairly obedient dog. He's a pretty smart dog. He tolerates a lot. Our children just torture the dog, and he never bites back. He's got a few sort of basic commands and a couple of party tricks. Like, he's just a good party trick. He knows his left from his right. So he can say left, and he turns to the left, and he says right, he turns to the right. That's absolutely not useful in anybody's life, even his, but it's a cool party trick. Nick's a good dog. But we joke about Nick, though he's a good dog, being bad at being a dog. Like, things that dogs should just do, Nick is bad at. So, for instance, the dog will be in the house maybe, and we're in the kitchen cooking, and we drop some crumbs on the floor. And most dogs, right, what should dogs do in that moment? They're like 4-legged vacuum cleaners, and they come sucking up all the crumbs. Our dog is like in the other room, like sniffing around, going, "I think somebody dropped something. Where's it at?" Like, "Nick, it's in here." No, stop smelling yourself. You didn't drop anything. He's just bad at being a dog. He's bad at protecting. He's not a good guard dog. We've lived in Noonan about 4 years now in our house, and in the 4 years that we've lived in our house, we've had to call the police, like 911, the police twice. I don't know what the national average is for number of times that you should have to call the police. 2 in 4 years feels like a lot. Most recently, it was because one of our kids locked himself in the bathroom when Molly and I were on the other side of the world, but that's another story for another day. I just got myself in trouble. The first time, we were asleep. It was 1 o'clock in the morning maybe, and somebody banged on our front door, and we woke up and went downstairs. There's nobody there, and then somebody saw like somebody in the backyard that had jumped over the privacy fence, and so they're running through the backyard, and then we thought we heard somebody wrestling or banging on the basement door, so we just weren't sure what was happening. We called 911. The police came. Thankfully, we weren't being slaughtered because they took forever to get there, so the police show up, and they're like, it's probably some punk kids, and I'm like, I know, but still, come check it out. So they go in the backyard with the flashlights that are as bright as the sun. They're walking around. They come back and there's nothing there. It's a bunch of punk kids. Great. You know where my dog was? In the backyard asleep. So before the police officer left, I said, hey, excuse me, sir, I don't know if they killed my dog or opened the gate and the dog has run away. Can I just go in the back deck and just yell for the dog? And this would have been a perfect place for his name to be Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. Just saying. So in the back, Nick, and he comes trotting up the steps to the back deck. He's wiping the sleepies out of his eyes, and it's like, what's the problem? And the dog slapped through multiple people, including the police, in the backyard. I'm like, you are a good dog, but you are miserable at being a dog. I don't think the disciples would have probably have articulated it in the same way. It's possible they would have felt the same sentiments. Jesus, if you're the Messiah, you're good. You do good things. You heal people. You take a boy's lunch and you feed 5,000 people. If you're here last week, we learned Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead. You do lots of really good things. But Jesus, if you're the Messiah, you're not very good at doing Messiah kinds of things. We're in a teaching series this summer that we've titled Jesus Is, in which we are trying to go through the Gospel of John. And all of us, I think, have a tendency to take little boxes that we want Jesus to fit in and try to squeeze Jesus into our boxes, our understanding of who he was and what he did. And what we're trying to do in this series during the summer is to set all of our preconceived notions of who Jesus is aside and look at 7 statements in the Gospel of John in which Jesus makes this claim: I am. I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am a gate. I am the good shepherd. I am the resurrection and the life. And then this morning in John chapter 14, verse 6, I am the way and the truth and the life. And no one comes to the Father except through me. The Gospel of John can really be divided into 2 halves. John chapter 1 through John chapter 12 describe the 3 years of public ministry of Jesus' life. So Jesus traveling around Judea and healing people and teaching people, all of those things that we know of the stories of Jesus as he travels around. The Gospel of John from chapter 1 through chapter 12 describe those things. So the first 12 chapters of John's Gospel are 3 years of Jesus' life. From chapter 13 to the end of the Gospel really describe 1 week of Jesus' life, maybe 10 days, where Jesus is arrested and crucified. Before he goes to the cross, he teaches his disciples some pretty important things. So the first 12 chapters are 3 years. The last, however many chapters from chapter 13 to chapter 21, is about a week or 10 days of Jesus' life. And the transition between those 2 sections of John's gospel and what happens there is absolutely critical for us understanding what Jesus says and why Jesus says what he does in chapter 14. I am the way and the truth and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through me. Last week, Jesus was in a place called Bethany, and there was a man, a friend of his, named Lazarus, who had died. Mary and Martha, Lazarus' siblings, were questioning Jesus why he didn't show up. And Jesus finally shows up, and you remember what happens? He raises Lazarus from the dead. And Jesus, there's a crowd. I mean, when you raise somebody from the dead, it's going to gather a crowd, isn't it? And Jesus has to get away from the crowd slightly, so he goes to a place called Ephraim, and he's hanging out in Ephraim for a while, and it's almost time for the Passover, and so Jesus goes back to Bethany. Bethany is close to the city of Jerusalem. Passover was the most significant religious feast for the people in the Old Testament, for the Jewish people, and people would travel from all over the land to come to Jerusalem to celebrate Passover. And Jesus is in Ephraim, and he comes to a place called back to Bethany, just a couple of miles, maybe an hour walk from Jerusalem city to Bethany. And Jesus comes back to Bethany, and he's there in Bethany, and you know what happens? Everybody remembers, oh, this is the guy that raised somebody from the dead. And the crowds gather. In fact, there's an interesting verse in John chapter 11 where the religious leaders were so concerned about the crowds gathering to worship Jesus and follow Jesus that they were not only going to kill Jesus, they were going to kill Lazarus to shut everybody up. Because when you come back from the dead, you gather a crowd, don't you? And so the crowd is gathering there in Bethany, and then Jesus is going to make his way from Bethany over the Mount of Olives, down the Kidron Valley, into the city of Jerusalem. And you know what happens? The crowd goes crazy. There's Palm Sunday. You remember Palm Sunday, the one the kids act out with palm branches that aren't ever palm branches? Jesus is on a triumphal journey on the way to Jerusalem, and the crowds are lining the streets with palm branches waving and on the ground so he can walk, not on the dirt. And they're screaming, Hosanna, and they're worshiping. This is the Messiah. See, there was a belief. There was a hope, an expectation that God from the Old Testament would send this promised Messiah, the Savior. And what would that Savior do? What would the Messiah do? He would make everything right. The Roman Empire who would come and take possession over the land, they would certainly be kicked out, and the Jewish people would be restored back to their place of prominence. Everything would be made right. And what Jesus is doing, raising from the dead, gathering the crowds gathering and worshiping and celebrating him, all of this makes perfect sense because this is Messiah kind of stuff. Jesus riding triumphantly into the holy city, and everybody that's gathered around believes, yes, God has fulfilled his promise. The Messiah has come. And it's in that background, against that background, in that context, where everybody is like, yes, maybe he is him, the Messiah. In that background, Jesus starts to do some things that made no sense. Everybody thinks the conquering king has arrived. And Jesus starts to say some things that made zero sense. John chapter 12, verse 33, Jesus says, the hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. But then he starts describing what that glorification would be. It's like a kernel of grain that falls down to the ground to die. That's not what the Messiah was going to be. In John chapter 12, verse 33, Jesus said this to show them the kind of death that he was going to die. And then in John chapter 13, Jesus gathers with his closest disciple, the 12 apostles, in an upper room to have a meal in the anticipation of the celebration of Passover. And he gathers with his disciples in John chapter 13. And everyone is thinking that this is the conquering king, the coming Messiah. And Jesus gets up and he takes off his outer garment and he wraps a towel around his waist and he gets down on his hands and his knees and he does the lowest of the lowly servant activity. He washes the nasty, grimy feet of his disciples. And they must have been thinking, Jesus, what are you doing? Because this isn't conquering king, coming Messiah kind of stuff. None of it made sense. And then at the end of the meal, Jesus begins speaking to his disciples, and he says things that just begin to fuel their confusion. John chapter 13, verse 33, "My children, I will be with you only a little longer. You will look for me, and just as I told the Jews, so I tell you now, where I am going, you cannot come." A little bit later, Peter asked, John chapter 13, verse 36, Simon Peter asked him, "Lord, where are you going?" And Jesus sort of reiterates, "You can't come with me where I'm going." And then in verse 37, Peter asked, "Lord, why can't I follow you? I will lay down my life for you." And Jesus says, "No, you won't. You will deny that you even know me." Now, I want you to sense what's just transpired. Jesus shows up in Bethany, having raised the man from the dead, and the crowds go crazy, believing that the promised Messiah is coming, and they line the streets to worship and praise him. And then Jesus shows up in Jerusalem, and he says things and he does things that make no sense. Not at all what the Messiah should say or should do. And these men who were with Jesus, they're confused, unsettled. And Jesus says in John chapter 14, we're going to get to verse 6 here in just a minute. Jesus says in John chapter 14, verse 1, "Do not let your hearts be troubled." See, they were troubled because they had given everything to follow this Jesus. They had sacrificed their careers, their professions, their families, and they had spent the past 3 years giving everything they had to follow this Jesus as he traveled throughout Judea. And because they believed he was the Messiah, and he was going to make everything right, and he was the coming king, and he was going to restore the people of God to their prominence. And now there's this Jesus going, "Yeah, but I'm going to die, and I'm going to go somewhere, and you can't come." What? Of course they're troubled. And Jesus says, "Do not let your hearts be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me." Verse 2. "My Father's house has many rooms. And if that were not so, I would have told you that I am, if that were not so, would I have told you that I am going there to prepare a place for you?" Verse 3. "And if I go prepare a place for you, I will come back to you to take you to be with me so that you will be where I am." Verse 4, "You know the way to the place where I am going." And then verse 5, Thomas said to him, "Lord, what are you talking about? We don't know where you're going. How can we know the way?" And poor Thomas, every time Thomas shows up in Scripture, he's like doubting or asking these kind of questions. And Thomas is like, "You say you're going somewhere. We don't have a clue where you're going. How are we going to know the way?" And in response to that question, Jesus says this, "I am the way and the truth and the life. And no one comes to the Father except through me. If you really know me, you will know my Father as well. For from now on, you do know him and have seen him." The disciples are frustrated, confused, unsettled, troubled. And Jesus says, "Listen, don't be troubled, because I'm going somewhere, and I'm going to make a dwelling place for you." I think we've commercialized and cheapened a little bit what Jesus says in verse 2. The Old King James Version used the word mansion, which is probably not the right word to use there. Most of our current English versions don't use the word mansion. But we had this idea that was actually fueled by some really bad Christian music in the 90s, but that's another conversation again for another day. That Jesus is going to heaven, and we're going to get 40 acres and a pond, and we get to pick out our floor plan, right? And that's not what Jesus is saying. He's not going, but the idea of what Jesus is saying about going to prepare a place for us is not to talk about the extravagance of the place that Jesus is making, but it's rather to say this: God created the universe. And guess what? He wants you to come and dwell with him for all of eternity. Wow. Jesus says, "I'm going to go and make a place, make a way for you to come and dwell in my Father's house forever." And Thomas says, "We don't know how to get there." And Thomas's question, gets to the very heart of the human predicament, doesn't it? That something has separated us from God, and we have this longing in our hearts to get back home to God. And what separated us from God? We know that this is the gospel, right? Sin separates us. It creates this chasm, this divide between us and a relationship with God. And Jesus says, listen, I am the path. I am the way home. Jesus is this bridge over the chasm that's caused by our sin, separating us from God. Jesus says, I can get you there. I'm the way. And that way, listen, don't miss this morning that way was a cross. In fact, Jesus says this in John chapter 14, and just a couple of chapters later, just a couple of days later, Jesus would be handed over by a betrayer and arrested, spit upon, and beaten some more. The crown of thorns would have been pressed down into his skull, and he would have laid down on a wooden beam. Pretty large stakes would have been placed into his hands, into his feet, hammered in. That's the way. And then Jesus says, I'm the truth, that there is truth. And though we live in a world that says, well, your truth is good for you and my truth is good for me, that really there is no absolute truth, that whatever you believe is good and whatever I believe is good. And Jesus interrupts that nonsense and he says, I am the truth, that there is truth. And truth is different than whatever you feel, that there is a truth. There is a truth about who God is. There is a truth about the human predicament. There is a truth about the path that God created to make a way home. There is a truth, and it's me. And then Jesus says, I am the life. That this path that I am creating to get you across the chasm that's been created or caused by your sin, that this path gets you on a life. And Jesus says in John 10:10, I have come to give you life and life abundant. God wants to give you a life that is full and rich and blessed because of the path that we're on. And then he says, that's the only option. There is no plan B. No one comes to the Father except through me. The only solution to the problem caused by sin in our world, Jesus says, is me. Because I am the way, I am the truth, and I am the life, and no one comes to the Father except through me. Now, let me pause. I'm fully aware this morning that some of you hear that. That's sort of like the heart of the gospel message. Right? And some of you hear that. And like, if we were one of those churches where you talk back to the preacher, there would be this like hearty, amen, preach it, brother, right? There's just, for some of you, there is this immediate like, yes, I believe this, that's right, that's true, right? Yes. But I also am fully aware that some people, and even some of you in the room this morning, are going to be uncomfortable with such exclusive and dogmatic claims that there is one way and there is no plan B. In fact, I would contend that this is probably the most controversial of the 7 I am statements in the Gospel of John. Because Jesus gives no margin for something other than absolute commitment to who he is. You can't read John chapter. If our goal of the summer series is to say, okay, I'm going to set aside all of my preconceived notions about who Jesus is, and I'm going to open this book, and I'm going to let these 7 statements define who Jesus is, there is no margin for anything other than Jesus making an exclusive, dogmatic, I am the only way home statement. I find the words of C.S. Lewis to be helpful in his book, Mere Christianity. I put them on the screen for you, hopefully. Lewis says this: a man who was merely a man and said the sort of things that Jesus said would not be a good moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic on the level with the man who says he is a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool, you can spit at him, you can kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let us not come with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us. He did not intend to. See the point? There is no margin in Jesus' words for something other than absolute commitment to who he says he is. If we want to accept Jesus on his terms, we have to wrestle with this I am claim, that I am the way, and I am the truth, and I am the life, and no one, there's no margin for any exceptions. There's no footnotes. There's nothing else. No one comes to the Father except through me. We either believe that or we don't. There's no middle ground. And yet I am fully aware that in our world and in our culture, the people that we encounter on a daily basis, and let's just be honest, maybe even some of you in the room this morning are very uncomfortable with such dogmatic and exclusive claims. But this is who Jesus says he is. I think one of the ways that I can serve us this morning, I've been thinking about how do we respond? How does our world, our culture respond to these exclusive truth claims that Jesus makes that says, I am the way, the truth, and life, and nobody gets to God except through me? There's really, I think, three major challenges that people have to that truth claim statement, to that absolute dogmatic exclusive statement. I think that gets challenged in three very specific ways. Let me highlight them, and then in doing so, maybe give you a way to respond when you hear it. We'll start easy and get hard. Number one, religious moralism. Religious moralism. See, there's this belief, moralism, that would be held by most of the world's religions and by most people, that would simply suggest that the path to God, or really all religious experience, is all about being good. Make good moral decisions. Right? Does it make sense? If you want to be good, if you want to be on a path to get you to God, all religion is ultimately about making us good, making us make good moral decisions. So you can think about your life like a big giant scale, like the old scales of justice, right? On one side, you put all of the bad stuff you've done, right? You said something ugly about someone, you cut someone off in traffic, somebody cut you off in traffic, and you said something ugly about them. All the bad stuff, put it on one side of the scale. That's your life. And on the other side of the scale, all the good things. You fed somebody, you said something nice about somebody, you did the dishes without being asked. That hit close to home for several of us. Right, you did all the good stuff. And at the end of your life, cross your fingers that when you take your last breath, the scales of justice have tipped in the right way. That's moralism. Just be good. And it doesn't really matter what your religious expression is, or even if you have a religious expression, as long as you are a good person. But what's so distinctive about Christianity is that we acknowledge up front, you will never be good enough. That's what separates Christianity from every other one of the world's religions, that says, we know we're not good. We will never tip the scales of justice in the right direction. We aren't good enough. And so Jesus has come to make a path, because we never could do that on our own. If someone says all religion is just about putting people on the right path to make good decisions and make the world a better place, you can just disagree with that because that's not the Jesus of John 14. Because he said, you're not good enough. You make a lousy path. Like we make a horrible path to get back to God because we're not good enough. And yet, even as Christians, don't we struggle with this? Don't we struggle with the pull towards moralism to say that our life is just about being good? And it shows up as either fear or guilt. Fear believing that, oh, wow, I kind of screwed up today. I hope God doesn't put a for sale sign at my mansion in heaven. And we live in this constant fear that we can never please God. Or we live with guilt that absolutely robs us of joy. Listen to me, listen. There is nothing that you could do to add to or take away from the finished work of Jesus Christ on the cross. You are a horrible path. And so am I. You cannot be good enough to get yourself home. And so Jesus came. He said, I am the way, I am the truth, and I am the life. And nobody gets to go home except through me. The second challenge to Jesus' exclusive claims in John 14 is, I'll just label it as religious pluralism. Pluralism is an assumption that there is no single religious tradition that is right or exclusive of other religious traditions. There are many paths to God. Or all the paths are in some way getting to the same God, though we might give him a different name or a different expression of who he is. It's a belief that would say, you do you, I'll do me, and as long as we sort of don't bump into each other too much, then we can both have our own specific religious expressions. Robert Wilkin, in his book, Remembering the Christian Path, helpfully articulates the issue like this. I want you to hear this. What is different today, I suspect, is not that Christianity has to confront other religions, but that we now call the situation religious pluralism. For behind the term religious pluralism lurks not so much a question as an answer. The view that particular traditions cannot be the source of ultimate truth. Because that's the issue, isn't it? Jesus says, I am the way, I am the what? Truth. Is there absolute truth? Is there something that is true regardless of what somebody says about it? Jesus says absolutely there is, but that gets challenged in our culture, doesn't it? Because of this belief of pluralism. But let me suggest, before we start pointing fingers too far outside the walls of our buildings, that pluralism has seeped its way into American Christianity. The Barna Research Group, who is a reliable research organization, Christian-oriented, that does a lot of research and study around the state of the church, and particularly in America, over the past few years have been studying this issue of religious pluralism. And here are some of the findings that they have concluded. 59% of American adults believe that Christians and Muslims worship the same God, even though they have different names and different beliefs regarding God. 59% of American adults. So 6 out of 10 people that you would find in any given context in the country would say that Christians and Muslims worship the same God. When the question is asked of those who would label themselves as a practicing Christian, like you and I, 40% indicated the same thing, that they believe the same thing. 3 out of 10 practicing Christians strongly agree that all people pray to the same God or the same Spirit, no matter what name they use for that spiritual being. 25% of practicing Christians strongly agree that what is morally right or wrong depends on what an individual believes. And 26% of practicing Christians, people like us, would say it doesn't matter what religious faith you follow because they all teach the same lessons. It's frightening. And you may say that, well, we were different than that. We wouldn't have those same statistics. Maybe so. Or maybe not. But there is an alarming trend of religious pluralism sweeping across American Christianity. And let's just be honest, some of you may feel the pull towards that. Friends, family, colleagues, co-workers, classmates who have different religious pasts and religious traditions, and maybe it's okay. And I want you to hear, Jesus says in John chapter 14, I am the way and the truth and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through me. Jesus gives no margin for religious pluralism. He just doesn't. If we want to accept Jesus on his terms. The third way that this exclusive claim of Jesus gets challenged in our culture, I'll just use the word tolerance. Moralism, pluralism, tolerance. And this one gets hard. Intolerance, isn't intolerance just like the unforgivable sin in our culture, right? Tolerance is a price commodity. I mean, the moment that you say something that counters what somebody else says, that infringes on some belief that they have, then you are immediately labeled intolerant, right? The moment you take a conviction that you believe something to be true, regardless of what it is, you are immediately labeled intolerant of someone else's position or belief. Now, this is a bad example, and I said this in the first service, and I was like, I probably shouldn't say this, but I said it anyway. It's usually never stopped me, so I'm going to say it again. This is going to sound like I'm making a political statement, and I'm not. I'm using it purely illustratively. I was studying John 14 this week, and I had some news playing in the background, and there was a story, and I ended up going to watch the hearing. There was a congressional hearing, I believe in the Senate, on the impact of the Supreme Court decision to overturn Roe v. Wade, right? So we get a little delicate issues here, right? So I'm not making a political statement. I'm just using this purely illustratively. And there was a congressional hearing that was happening, and there was a congressman who made a statement, a senator who made a statement that he believed a biological male could not get pregnant, to which he was immediately accused of being intolerant and inciting violence. Now, I'm not making any sort of political statement about what I believe or don't believe about any of those issues. Here's my point, that if you see the world in which we live, that if you make a claim, regardless how seemingly sound the claim is, and someone doesn't like it, you are immediately labeled an intolerant bigot. That's just the world in which we live. That's the world, listen, that's the world in which the Church of Jesus Christ has been called to do its mission. And let's just be honest. Our world, our culture doesn't like John 14, verse 6. The world doesn't like a Jesus who says he is the only way. Nor does our culture like a Jesus that says there is truth and it is absolute. And the challenge for us as Christ followers is whether we are going to embrace who Jesus says that he is at the risk of embracing the label of being intolerant or even worse. It's a choice. But I'm going to say something. I want you to listen. Look up here and listen carefully. And I'm going to overstate something because I absolutely want you to hear it. Embracing absolute truth is not an excuse to be a jerk. Embracing absolute truth is not an excuse to be a jerk. Jesus made the most dogmatic statement that I think a person could ever make. I am the only way that you can get to God. But Jesus, you know where he was? He was hanging out with prostitutes and drunks and outcasts. And they loved him. And they kept inviting him to their parties. You can hold fast to the truth claims of John chapter 14, verse 6. I am the way, and I am the truth, and I am the life. And we should, and in doing so, we should still sell ourselves out caring for and loving the world around us. Dogmatic, exclusive truth doesn't give us an excuse to be those people. John chapter 14, verse 6 is a hard teaching, a hard truth, a hard I am claim. Not lost on me. Clint went on vacation on this one. And it's going to get challenged. Challenged by the belief of moralism that really all life is about is just making us good people. And if you're good enough at the end of your life when you take your last breath, then you're going to be right with whatever God that you believe in. Or pluralism. All paths lead to God. There's different expressions, but it's all the same thing. However, whatever label you want to put on your religious experience is fine. It's fine. And then tolerance. Don't be intolerant. Don't infringe a truth claim on what somebody else might believe or think. Those are the challenges that we experience as we think about John chapter 14, verse 6. And against that, Jesus says, all right, here's who I am. I am the way and the truth and the life. And nobody comes to the Father except through me. And that's the question for us then. Here's the question. Like cards on the table. Here's the question. Have we accepted a version of Jesus that makes us acceptable in our culture? Or have we chosen the Jesus of John chapter 14? Because they're not the same Jesus. Have we chosen to surrender our lives to a version of Jesus that allows us to fit in pretty comfortably in the world in which we live? Or have we chosen the Jesus of John chapter 14, verse 6, who says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and guess what? Nobody gets to God except through me. Those are not the same Jesus. And you have to choose. Because Jesus leaves no margin for both. I think about our students. Hey, middle school guys, high school guys, college, university. My oldest is going off to university this year. Listen, look up here for just a second. I know you can tune out sometimes. Look up here for just a second, students. I am fully aware that in your classrooms, on your sports teams, peer groups, your friends, like you're going to hear these ideas of moralism and pluralism and tolerance. And they'll have different labels and different words. But you have to choose. You have to choose. Am I going to accept a version of Jesus that lets me fit in really easily? Or am I going to accept the version of Jesus that he tells me he is in John chapter 14, verse 6? They're not the same. You know, I think about all of us who have jobs and we live in neighborhoods and we have families and we go to restaurants, and every day we bump into people who maybe the labels are different, but the ideas of moralism and pluralism and tolerance are the values of our world and our culture. And there's a choice. We choose the Jesus that allows us to fit in comfortably and easily in our culture, or we choose the Jesus of John chapter 14, verse 6, because they're not the same. I think about those in church leadership. And in our culture, the increasing pressure to not be intolerant by an absolute truth claim of what's right and what's wrong. And the pressure of that. Churches in our country are going to have to continue to make a decision to say, I'm choosing the Jesus as he tells me he is in John chapter 14, verse 6. John 14 begins a long teaching that Jesus gives to his disciples. And in the next chapter, chapter 15, Jesus says something that must have just rattled them. In John 15, verse 18, Jesus says this, if the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first. If you belong to the world, it would have loved you as its own. But as it is, you do not belong to the world. I have chosen you out of the world. And that's why the world hates you. It's a pleasant message for your Sunday morning, isn't it? But Jesus never promised that accepting him will make us friends with our culture and our world. He never promised that. Now, let me restate what I've already said. That is not an excuse to turn our nose up to our world. We should invest our lives showing love and compassion and care to the world around us. But Jesus never promised that's going to win you any friends. In fact, just the opposite. Jesus was so extreme that he said following him may just mean the world is going to hate you. But we don't get to choose who Jesus is. He does that. And in his words, he says, I'm the way, and I'm the truth, and I'm the life. I'm the only path that bridges the chasm that's caused by our sin. I am the only one that can get you home. If your heart is longing for home this morning, Jesus is the only one. And all other expressions of being a good person are going to fail you. And all other religious experience that promise a life of abundance are going to fail you. And if you try to be tolerant to everybody, you're going to fail yourself. And Jesus says, I'm the only one that can get you home. And my prayer this morning, my hope this morning, my deepest desire is that this is the Jesus that you have given your life to serve. Jesus who said this, I am the way, I am the truth, and I am the life. And no one gets to the Father